This episode is sponsored by Wix. Go to wix.com/go/simplehistory to create a website now.
How to build a home fallout shelter in the Cold War. By 1961, the Cold War was heating up and the threat was becoming real as the Soviets had intercontinental ballistic missiles with sufficient range and numbers to threaten the mainland of America. These missiles carried nuclear warheads with the equivalent explosive power of 3 million tons of TNT. A direct hit from one of these missiles, or being within hundreds of yards of one detonating, meant certain death, whether you were in a shelter or not, as either the blast, the 500-mile-an-hour shockwave, or the massive burst of radiation would almost certainly kill you. But in a fallout shelter, if you were several miles away from the impact site, you might stand some kind of a chance, and this is what they were designed for. There was neither the money nor necessary planning in place. The federal government's strategy was try and persuade the American public for the need for personal shelters and to take responsibility to prepare for the worst, rather than rely on the government to provide mass public shelters and support. So suddenly, there was a need to try and protect the civilian population from such devastation by encouraging the building of personal fallout shelters. After a nuclear attack, given that you survived the blast, there was the danger of radioactive fallout that could contaminate the air and soil, lasting for weeks, months, or even years in the surrounding environment. So the fallout shelter had to be designed to shield people from these effects. One option was to buy a prefabricated shelter, which was like a steel cylinder with a submarine-style hatch. Another was the several possible private shelter designs to build both underground and overground in such areas as the basement or your backyard. Instruction manuals and TV shows demonstrated to the American public how to build them as a do-it-yourself project. The shelter's walls and roof could be built from solid, thick concrete blocks to absorb and shield from radiation. The entrance, no more than 2 feet wide, was strictly built with a right-angled turn to prevent most of the radiation rays getting in as radiation travels in a straight line. If it was outside in the backyard, a hatch would provide entry. A basic basement shelter, according to the manuals, could be built for $150 to $200 at the time. Ventilation was supplied by vents in the bottom of the shelter wall and with air vent pipes which were attached to a filter mechanism on the surface. Turning a hand-cranked blower attached to the vent pipe would bring in fresh air. With fallout shelters, there was a real fear that unprepared neighbors in desperation might try to enter the shelter, so sometimes air vents that lead to the surface were camouflaged and tamper-proof. Heat could build up very quickly in a small confined shelter because of the occupant's body heat and because earth is a good thermal insulator. Climate control therefore could aid in cooling, but it was an expensive feature of shelters. The shelter would be stocked with canned food and water rations required to survive an extended length of time. Supplies and equipment for sanitation as well as medical supplies were also stocked inside. One of the obvious problems, apart from rationing water for the duration of the shelter, was the toilet. A solution was to use a bag and a garbage can with a tight-fitting cover. The waste could be kept in the can until it was safe to leave the shelter. It was also important to keep a radio to stay in touch with other survivors and Conelrad broadcasts. Ideally, an electrical generator was installed in the shelter to provide lighting and other comforts of home. Whether a homemade do-it-yourself shelter would have been effective if a nuclear attack did take place during the Cold War is debatable. While they may have blocked radiation, the occupants may have suffered by the time it was okay to go back outside because of the lack of air handling and waste disposal systems, as well as the high temperatures. In 1959, the U.S. government produced a do-it-yourself book. It was later found out that only a small percentage of Americans had actually received and read it. In 1962, just 1.4% of Americans had a nuclear fallout shelter, which meant that 98.6% of people had to rely on federal or state or county shelters, and there were simply not enough of them. So what was the reason? It was likely cost. In a survey at the time, 67% of Americans simply felt they could not afford to build their own fallout shelter.
This episode of Simple History was brought to you by Wix. People invested in fallout shelters in the Cold War, and you can protect yourself from obscurity. Wix is the place to go to make that professional-looking site you've always wanted to make. Go to wix.com/go/simplehistory to create a site that is customized to what you want to do, regardless of your skill level. Wix has great features such as Wix Videos, Wix Pro Gallery, Wix Bookings, and solutions for all kinds of sites such as e-commerce, music, hotels, events, restaurants, and more. Invest in your future and protect yourself from obscurity. Go to wix.com/go/simplehistory or simply click the link in the description below to get started.